global warming and for that. So, as a candidate, you get elected, what's the first step that you would make, that you would take to solve the energy crisis and deal with the energy policy? The very first step you would do.
You're dead on. Thank you for asking that. Energy policy is a leverage point that is interdependent across society. And if we don't deal with it well, we mess up everything else. But the good news is if we deal with it well, there's a tremendous opportunity here. And we painted ourselves into a corner, and we didn't take Jimmy Carter's lead back in the late 70s. And we've maintained our dependency on fossil fuels. And while that's terrible, we can still deal with that, and we can create opportunity out of the mess that we're in. A core idea of this campaign is that we need to take the energy subsidies that we give to big oil and big coal, nuclear power, and redirect those towards starting a green industry in this country that will support the mass production of solar panels, geothermal heat pumps, hydro turbines, both sea-based and river, and wind turbines. And we should also take a small percentage to start with. This 2.5% of our military budget, that's $25 billion a year, and take that large pot of money and make a foothold with this issue by making sure that every town, Augusta, Waterville, Kittery, Fort Kent, that where the municipality wanted to purchase some of its own clean generational capacity and get a zero-interest loan from our government or an outright grant if it's an impoverished area like Calais, which I was earlier in the week in Washington County. And if we did that, then towns could become more energy independent. That power could stay locally, the wealth could stay locally, it would help the local economy, but also create immediate need for an industry that needs a boost. And if we could do that, we could create, as Germany has, hundreds of thousands of new jobs in a very short time. It's a tremendous economic, educational project for schools. It's a health, everything you just said, it's a health issue, but most importantly, it's a future security issue. And we have to get a foothold. We have to reduce our emissions by 10% in the next 3 years. We want to turn around global warming. And that's not going to happen without leadership that is willing to forget about lobbyists and say, this is what we need to do.
Energy...
where the nutrients are gone from the soil, and we're overusing the land. And so ethanol is not the answer. It keeps us dependent at the pump, keeps us burning fossil fuels. The powers that be, I think, are very happy with that because we'll continue to keep walking down the path that we are. That's not the solution. We also have to be careful when we talk about burning anything. What's in it? And while in the short term it certainly would help people in Fort Kent and Masardis and in our wood industry, if in the short term as a transition we're burning more wood, that has its place, but it's not a long-term solution. And we talk about burning trash to energy, there's no free lunch there, and we can create a lot of issues by thinking that there is one. Instead, we need to focus, while I agree research has its place, we have technology right now that we can turn this problem around with if we simply fund the things that I talked about earlier. And here in Maine, we are rich in those resources. We can be an exemplar for the rest of the world. The tides along our coast, there's only several places in the world with tides that at all compare with what happens in Washington County. And yet, while President Kennedy called for that resource to be developed back in the 60s, we haven't touched it. FDR did back in the 40s. There was an initial plan in the teens. And there's some good reason why that hasn't happened. The good news is it can still happen now. We can turn that bus around in a hurry and create a better economic future for ourselves. Perfect.
Next question.
When we look at foreign policy, war, and the Middle East, we need to remember an ancient line, that is, we reap what we sow. And you're right, it's very easy, by some measures, it's certainly very difficult by others, to train a sower. And yet, we don't train ourselves in how do we sow the seeds of peace abroad. And when we look at the Middle East, the term fair broker has been left off the table for a long time. And until we appear to the world to be more even-handed in dealing with the Israeli situation, we'll continue to elicit hatred from far too many people. I think that's a critical issue. It doesn't mean that we shortchange our support of Israel, but it means that we make Israel understand, and the world understand, that because Israel is surrounded by a sea of enemies, it's in Israel's interest to make peace with all of its neighbors. And it's in our interest to facilitate that and to lead therein. The plight of the Palestinian people is horrific, and if Americans were squarely facing them in the face, we wouldn't stand for it. And yet, it's perceived by the outside world that we sanction that suffering because we haven't dealt with it. And so, the best defense we can have against terrorism that comes out of the Middle East or anywhere else is that we make it national policy that we understand that we need to sow the seeds of peace. And what is that? It means we take our ideals and we export them along with everything else. We don't just do $10 billion weapon deals and swing through the Gulf. Rather, we make sure that everyone there has access to medical care, that we facilitate that the best we can, to clean water, to food that they can depend on, so that they can start working toward their own dreams. Absolutely, the best investment we can make as a nation is to invest in education. Let's talk about a few of the things you mentioned. First, when we look at access to universal preschool. Many families are fortunate and their child has someone at home with them, in those early formative years, and such as my family was fortunate that way. My wife's worked part-time the last several years. And perhaps for those families, they don't need access to preschool. But many of our families do, with two people working. When 100 million Americans live in or on the edge of poverty, when the children from those families go into kindergarten, typically they're 2.7 to 1.5 years behind their peers. Access to preschool, if it were universal and we supported it as a national effort, could help that gap be bridged by first grade. And we look at the kids that's happened with, when we look at studies that have happened over time, we've got a lot of experience here. Those students graduate in far greater numbers, and if you look at it simply, take the morality and values out of it, look at it as a business plan, those students in the long run generate a lot more funding for themselves and tax revenue for the government. Universal preschool pays for itself. When it comes to not being so intrusive in supporting education itself, No Child Left Behind, by several measures, I believe set us back 20 years. And that it took the focus off good teaching and it put the focus on end benchmark tests, which obviously don't work for everyone. It also narrowed our focus to a couple specific intelligence areas that are measured typically on the SAT, linguistic intelligence and logical intelligence. There are many other genius young Americans whose gifts got marginalized in that process, and teachers who are great gifts in teaching to those kids who got marginalized in their craft as well. Assessment is important, but if we put all of our focus there, we don't end up supporting instruction like we need to. Finally, K-16 support for education. We need to open up pathways for all of our kids to get to school. Eventually, that needs to be, just like K-12, needs to be something that's an inalienable right. In the short run, if we should take our AmeriCorps program and expand it dramatically so that anyone who does 1 year of service gets 2 years of in-state tuition, and that should be at least a foothold on that issue with a goal of covering K-16 eventually.
And I'm going to add to that.